The cup sat at Eliza's right hand, steam rising in a thin pale thread, and she lifted it the way she lifted it every evening. Slowly, with both hands curved around the porcelain, her eyes lowered in the manner Thomas preferred. He watched her from his chair across the table. He always watched. She drank, set the cup down, folded her hands in her lap, and said nothing. The fire crackled once in the grate, and the room returned to its practiced silence. Thomas reached for his own cup, satisfied. And Eliza kept her face perfectly still. What he did not know, what he had not known for several months, was that she had switched the cups before he sat down. She had been doing it since early spring. On the evenings when Nance set the tray and then slipped out of the room with her eyes too careful and her hands too quick. Eliza had noticed Nance's hands first. Then she had noticed her own sleep, which came too heavily and lasted too long and left her with a cottony distance behind her eyes that no amount of morning air could clear. Then she had noticed the taste, faintly bitter beneath the milk, not quite right for the blend Thomas had delivered from London the previous autumn. She had said nothing. She had begun writing things down instead. This is the account of how Eliza Hartwell survived the winter at Ashwick Park, and what it cost her, and what it finally gave her back. Her father had died in October of 1811, leaving a house in Shropshire, a modest library, and £4,000 of debt drawn against a merchant's credit he had extended too freely and repaid too slowly. The house sold quickly. The library dispersed in a single morning. The debt remained, attaching itself to Eliza with the pleasant neutrality of a legal instrument that does not trouble itself with a person's feelings. She was 23 years old, trained as a governess, possessed of a careful education, and no living relations. The solicitor had been kind in his summary. There were few options available to a young woman in her position. There was, however, a gentleman who had expressed an interest and whose financial circumstances were sufficient to absorb the outstanding obligation. The gentleman's name was Thomas Johansen, Baron Ashwick. He was 41 years old. He had buried one wife already. Eliza had understood the arrangement precisely. She had not pretended otherwise to herself, alone in the small hired room where she spent the 3 weeks between her father's burial and her wedding. She was not being chosen. She was being acquired, the way a man acquires a ledger entry he finds useful, and the transaction had the virtue of efficiency, if nothing else. She had stood at the altar in a gray wool dress because black was too absolute, and she could not afford anything new. And Thomas had placed his hand over hers with a deliberate pressure that she catalogued as proprietary rather than affectionate. His mother, Lady Dorothea, had watched from the front pew with an expression Eliza would come to know well. A settled certainty, the look of a woman who has arranged the room to her satisfaction and expects it to remain that way. "She is plain enough," Lady Dorothea had said, to a woman beside her, in the vestry afterward. She had not lowered her voice. "And provincial, of course. Thomas requires someone manageable." Nance had been assigned to Eliza's rooms that same afternoon. She was a small, quick-eyed woman of perhaps 30 who had served at Ashwick Park for 12 years, and whose loyalty to the house and whose loyalty to Eliza sorted themselves out within a fortnight, without either of them saying a word about it. Nance brought the morning chocolate. She pressed Eliza's dresses with more care than was strictly required. When Thomas passed Eliza in the corridor without speaking, Nance would appear within minutes with a small unnecessary errand and keep herself in Eliza's vicinity until the sound of his footsteps had moved to another wing. The autumn passed. Thomas managed the estate with cold efficiency. He was not violent. He was not openly cruel. He was instead methodically indifferent, except in the evenings when he joined Eliza in the drawing room for tea and watched her with a quality of attention she could not yet name. She read. He watched. She set her needlework down. He watched. She drank her tea. He watched most carefully of all, and the word she finally settled on, alone in her journal by candlelight, was anticipatory. He was waiting for something, and she did not yet know what it was. By December, the cottony distance had become a fixture. She slept 9 hours and woke tired. She forgot words in the middle of sentences. She dropped a letter she was writing to a former colleague and could not remember, afterward, what she had meant to say. She wrote these things down in the journal she kept locked in the compartment at the back of her dressing case, the one Nance knew about and never touched. In February, she asked Nance to let her set the tray herself some evenings. She said she liked the occupation. Nance did not question this. She simply began leaving the drawing room door on the latch and placing the tray on the sideboard nearest the window, where Eliza could reach it first. The first evening Eliza switched the cups. Thomas had watched her drink and said, "You look better tonight. More color." She had thanked him and returned to her book. By the time the mud tracks dried from the lanes in April and Edmund Vane, Earl of Greyvale, arrived at Ashwick Park to discuss the boundary dispute that had simmered between his estate and Thomas's for the better part of 2 seasons, Eliza had filled 9 pages of the small notebook with dates and observations, and the cottony distance had almost entirely cleared. She was, in all the ways that counted, herself again. She stood at the drawing-room window and watched the Earl's carriage come up the drive, and she thought, with a dry precision she had recovered along with her sleep, that the occasion of a boundary dispute seemed a thin pretext for a man of his rank to attend in person. He was taller than she had expected. She had heard of him from the local families, in the way one hears of a fixed geographic feature. The Earl of Greyvale occupied Greyvale Hall 4 miles east, had inherited the title 6 years ago at 30, and had not remarried after the death of his first countess. He was described, variously, as severe, as principled, and as someone whose good opinion was not easily obtained. She watched him hand his gloves to the footman at the door and speak 2 words to Thomas that she could not hear through the glass, and she thought that severe was probably the accurate word. Thomas brought him to the drawing-room. Eliza rose and curtsied and said, "My lord," in the proper form. Edmund looked at her for a moment with gray eyes that did not carry the usual masculine inventory she had grown accustomed to in the houses where she had served. He was not assessing her appearance. He was, she thought afterward, doing something closer to reading. Then he said, "Lady Ashwick," in a level voice, and turned to take the chair Thomas offered him. And the moment closed, like a book pressed shut. The boundary dispute required 3 visits over a fortnight. On the first, Thomas was present throughout. On the second, a matter of drainage and an inconvenient ditching record kept Thomas in his study for the better part of an hour, and Eliza sat with Edmund in the library with the map spread on the table between them, and they talked about the drainage survey, and then about the tenant farms on the disputed strip, and then about nothing in particular. He had a quality of stillness she had not often encountered in men with his degree of authority. He did not speak to fill silence. When he did speak, the sentences were short and level, and arrived as though they had been considered. She found herself, more than once, saying something she had not planned to say. She mentioned the tenant family in the lower field, the Hargroves, whose lease Thomas had refused to renew. Edmund's eyes moved to her face. "For what reason?" he said. He did not give one. She paused. "The child is 3 years old." Edmund said nothing for a moment. Then, "I see." He was watching her the same way again, that quality of attention that was not assessment. It had a different texture than Thomas's watching. Thomas watched for a result. This felt more like recognition of something already present. She had her pin money, what remained of it, which was very little. £3 and a few shillings, the last of the quarter's allowance. 2 days after that library conversation, she carried it to the Hargrove cottage herself, on foot, in the thin mud of the April lanes, in her plainest boots. She told Mrs. Hargrove it was a contribution toward the family's removal costs to her sister's house in Ludlow. Mrs. Hargrove cried. The child watched from the doorway with huge, solemn eyes. Eliza walked back to the park alone and told no one. She did not know that Edmund had ridden the boundary line that afternoon and seen her returning up the track, her skirt hem-brown with mud, moving at a steady, deliberate pace that was nothing like a woman who expected to be seen. He had not announced himself. He had held his horse still on the ridge above the Hargrove lane and watched her until she reached the park gate. Then he had ridden back toward Greyvale without stopping. The third visit brought the boundary question to a provisional settlement, and Edmund departed with formal courtesies and a careful expression that told Eliza nothing. Thomas was pleased with the outcome. He said so at dinner, and poured himself a second glass, and watched Eliza with that anticipatory attention that had never fully subsided, and she thought, "He is waiting for me to become smaller." She understood now what he had been waiting for all winter. He had been waiting for her to lose her grip on herself, for the forgetting to deepen, for the silences to become confusion, for the confusion to become something a physician could name, for the name to become a verdict. She was not certain he had planned it so precisely from the beginning. She suspected it had begun as a domestic convenience, a way to ensure she slept and did not trouble him, and had gradually acquired a purpose. A wife declared unfit could be removed from managing her own affairs. A wife declared unfit could be managed in turn. Lady Dorothea had visited twice in the preceding months and had taken a particular interest in Eliza's lapses, which Eliza, now clear-headed, recognized as a form of inventory. The poor creature, Lady Dorothea had said to the woman beside her at the Hargrove church service in March, not troubling to keep her voice down. She was never strong. Thomas tells me she has been confused. It happens with women of her constitution. Eliza had heard it clearly from 2 rows back and had kept her eyes on the prayer book. By the time Edmund began his 4th and 5th visits in late May, the boundary papers required only signatures and small adjustments, and the pretexts grew thinner, and Thomas seemed not to notice, or perhaps did not mind, because the Earl of Greyvale's goodwill was worth a great deal to the management of Ashwick's eastern farms. Edmund came to tea once and to dinner once, and on the second occasion Eliza played the pianoforte after the meal at Thomas's instruction, and Edmund stood near the window with his glass and listened with an expression she could not read, and then, when she finished, said nothing at all for a moment that lasted slightly too long. Then he said, "That was Miss Hartwell's piece, I believe." She looked up from the keys. He had used her maiden name, precisely, as though correcting something. Thomas said, "Lady Ashwick, Greyvale, my wife." Edmund said, "Of course," and turned back to the window. She did not understand what had passed between them. She filed it in the notebook alongside the other things she could not yet explain. It was near the end of May, a Tuesday afternoon with rain coming in from the northwest and the light flat and gray over the fields, that she had gone to the cottage of a tenant woman named Mrs. Prescott, who had been ill with a lung complaint since Easter, and whose grown daughter had gone to work at the mill in Shrewsbury and was not expected back before July. Eliza had brought a pot of broth and a book of commonplace verse, the kind of volume that could be read aloud in short passages between coughing spells. She sat in the chair beside Mrs. Prescott's narrow bed and read 3 poems and half a fourth, and the rain came against the cottage window, and Mrs. Prescott dozed, and Eliza read on in a lower voice, more for herself than for the sleeping woman, the words steady and quiet in the small, close room. She had not heard the door. She did not know Edmund was there until he set something down on the table near the door, a package from the Greyvale kitchens by the look of it, and the small sound made her turn. He was standing just inside the threshold, still in his riding coat with the rain on the shoulders, and his face was doing something she had no name for. Not surprise. Not the polite attention he wore at dinner. Something older than either of those. She stood quickly, and Mrs. Prescott stirred without waking. "Forgive me," he said very low. "I did not mean to interrupt." "She is sleeping," Eliza said. "Yes." He did not move toward the door. She set the book face down on the chair. "Did you have an appointment with the Baron?" "I came to bring these." He nodded toward the package. "Mrs. Prescott was in service at Greyvale before she was married. I should have come sooner." Eliza looked at him. He was not looking at the package, or at Mrs. Prescott, or at the window. He was looking at Eliza with that same quality she had first noticed in the library, the quality of someone who has found what they were looking for and is being careful about it. "You came yourself," she said. "I was passing." He had not been passing. Greyvale Hall lay 4 miles east, and the Prescott cottage was a quarter-mile west of the Ashwick Park gate. She said nothing. The rain came harder against the window, and Mrs. Prescott breathed slowly in the bed, and the room held the two of them in a close quiet that Eliza was careful not to acknowledge. He left shortly after. She sat back down and opened the book again, and did not read a single word on the page. If you have found yourself caring already about what happens in this room, and what is growing in the silence between these two careful people, stay with us. The channel that shares these stories is yours to keep, and subscribing costs you nothing. Something had shifted after that afternoon in Mrs. Prescott's cottage. Edmund's visits did not become more frequent. They became more charged, in the way that a room becomes charged when a window has been opened and the air inside recognizes itself as changed. He asked her, on the next occasion he came to Ashwick, how she had come to know the Prescott family. She explained about the tenant rounds she had taken to making since the spring. He listened without the polite impatience she had grown accustomed to from Thomas's circle. She mentioned, cautiously, that she had also been helping an elderly man named Croft in the Northfield cottage with his correspondence, because his hands had stiffened over the winter and he could not hold a pen. Edmund said, "I did not know Croft was still on the estate." "He was retained when Thomas inherited," she said. "I think Thomas has forgotten he is there." Edmund looked at her for a moment and said, "Have you been doing this since the autumn?" "Since January." She paused. "It gives me something precise to do." He nodded slowly. She had the sensation, which she had been refusing for several weeks, that he understood her exactly. She knew nothing of his wife. She had heard the fact of the death, as one hears all such facts in a county. Without detail, without grief. From the outside. She learned what stood behind it on an afternoon in early June, when Thomas detained a tenant at the park gates over a disputed cart measurement, and Edmund waited in the library alone, and Eliza came in to offer tea, and found him standing at the window with his back to the room and a quality about him that she recognized from her own worst mornings after the bad winter. She set the tray down without announcing it, and turned to leave. "My wife died in November of 1809, he said. He had not turned from the window. "I was in Lincolnshire settling my uncle's affairs. She was delivered of a child 2 weeks before I was expected home." He paused. "I did not arrive in time." Eliza stood still. "I have been told, by several people, that my presence would not have altered the outcome." physicians and sensible women. I find that I cannot accept it as true." He turned then, and his face had the specific composed quality of a man who has had a great deal of practice being composed at the wrong moment. "I am not certain why I am telling you this," she said quietly. "Because you found me reading to a sick woman in a rain-soaked cottage, and it struck you as an act of staying when one might reasonably have left." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "Precisely that." Thomas came in 20 minutes later and found them drinking tea on opposite sides of the fireplace, speaking of the drainage schedule, and his expression gathered into something Eliza watched carefully from the corner of her eye. He was not a man who expressed jealousy plainly. He was a man who expressed it through management. That evening the tea arrived earlier than usual, and Nance's hands were very quick as she set the tray down and slipped out. And Eliza, lifting the cup she had switched, looked across the table at Thomas and said, "Your tea will go cold." He picked up his cup without looking at it, and drank, and said nothing. She wrote 3 more pages in the notebook that night. The Midsummer Assembly at the Shrewsbury Rooms was the only event of the season that Thomas required Eliza to attend. Lady Dorothea came up from her house in the village for it, and Miss Cecily Morrow, who was polished and fair-haired and had been engaged to Thomas for 11 months before Eliza's father's debt had become a more pressing matter, attended on the arm of a cousin and wore a silk gown the color of cream, against which Eliza's altered gray dress was not designed to compete. Eliza was aware of this. She was aware, too, that Lady Dorothea had positioned herself near the card tables where the elder county families gathered, and had been saying something that caused more than one of those families to look toward Eliza with a particular, careful sympathy that was not warmth. Edmund was present. He stood near the orchestra with the county's other senior men, and she saw him when she came in, and he saw her, and the moment that passed between them was brief and invisible to anyone watching, except perhaps Nance, who had accompanied Eliza as dresser and now stood near the wall with the other attendants, and whose eyes moved back and forth across the room like a woman tracking weather. Thomas took a glass from a passing tray and came to stand at Eliza's elbow, and after a few minutes of civil exchange with a neighboring family, he said, in the voice he used for observations, he wanted to appear offhand, "Lady Ashwick has been unwell this past season. We have all been concerned." He addressed this to the Hargreave family, who were standing nearest, and Mrs. Hargreave's face arranged itself into the concerned expression that had been prepared for it by Lady Dorothea's earlier commentary. Her nerves have been fragile. She has been confused at times. I have consulted a physician. Eliza stood very still. There was no physician. She had seen no physician. She is not always, Thomas continued pleasantly, fully herself. Eliza heard from the Hargreave family and from 2 other couples within range a collective soft murmur. She recognized it as the sound of a verdict being sealed. This was the machinery in its most efficient form. No violence, no scene, only a man saying a thing in a polished social voice, and a room receiving it. And afterward the thing had happened and could not be unhappened. She felt the color in her face, and kept her hands very quiet at her sides, and looked at a point on the opposite wall, and breathed. "Poor creature," Lady Dorothea said from the card tables, clearly to the woman beside her. "She has never been suited to this life. This is where some stories would end." Eliza turned from Thomas on the pretext of adjusting her shawl and moved toward the corridor with a steadiness she felt as pure will. And Nance appeared at her side within seconds, having read the room from across it, and said very quietly in her ear, "My lady." "Now?" "Yes," Eliza said. Fetch my reticule. The notebook was not in her reticule. She had been carrying the relevant pages folded inside her bodice for 6 days, since the evening she had decided, sitting alone in her room with the doors locked and the candle burning low, that she was done waiting for the machinery to finish its work. The pages were in her hand before she reached the anteroom door, and Edmund was already in the corridor. She did not know how he had moved so quickly across a crowded room. She knew only that he was there, 3 strides ahead of where she had expected to need to go, and that his face, when he turned to her, was not the composed, careful face of the drawing room. It was something stripped of the layer above it. He looked at her, and at the folded pages in her hand, and said nothing. She said, "I need you to read these." She handed him the pages. He took them without hesitation, and stood in the corridor light, and read. And his stillness as he read was the most absolute stillness she had yet seen from him. When he finished, he folded the pages with a precision that was itself a controlled anger, and said, "How long?" "Since December, I believe. I switched the cups in February. These are 9 weeks of observations." He has continued. "Every 3rd or 4th evening, I have noted the pattern." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw, without looking away, the specific thing his face did when the careful composure required more effort than it usually did. "I have a magistrate's warrant," he said, "pending sufficient cause." "I believe this constitutes it," she said. He said, "Nance has witnessed the ritual? She set the tray. She knows what he put into it and what he expected me to drink." He looked down at the folded pages once more, and then he put them carefully inside his coat, and he said, "Go back inside. Say nothing further to Thomas tonight. I will call at Ashwick in the morning with the magistrate. He will know something has shifted. Let him." Edmund's voice was level, but the line of his jaw was not. He has had several months to consider what he was doing. He may have a few hours more. She went back into the assembly rooms. She stood where she had stood before and said nothing, and let Thomas manage the evening as he chose to manage it. Edmund returned to the hall and spoke to 2 men she did not know, quietly and briefly, and left the assembly before supper. Cecily watched him go with a small, sharp collapse of expression that lasted only a moment. Lady Dorothea saw him leave, and a crease appeared between her brows. Thomas refilled his glass and did not notice any of it. Nance noticed all of it. The following morning was a Thursday in late June, bright and still, and Edmund arrived at Ashwick Park at 9:30 with the magistrate, a Mr. Pelham, and a second man who proved to be a physician, called at Edmund's request to provide a professional account of laudanum's properties and effects at the dosages recorded in Eliza's pages. Thomas was at breakfast. He looked up when the door opened, and his face performed a rapid adjustment that Eliza watched from the window where she had been standing since 7 o'clock. Nance stood at the far side of the room. She had dressed carefully. She had the look of a woman who has made a decision and is at peace with it. Mr. Pelham read the relevant portions of Eliza's record aloud. He asked Thomas 3 questions, and Thomas answered the first 2 with the smooth authority of a man accustomed to having his word accepted, and then the physician produced his own written summary, and Thomas's answers stopped. Edmund stood near the door throughout. He did not speak. He watched Thomas with an expression that was not anger and not satisfaction. It was, Eliza thought, the look of a man who has completed a necessary and unpleasant task with the precision it deserved. Lady Dorothea had been sent for. She arrived from the village in less than the hour, dressed for confrontation in the manner of a woman who has spent 60 years preparing for moments exactly like this one. She entered the room and looked at the magistrate and the physician and at Eliza, and she said with the remnant of her settled certainty, "This is a domestic matter. Lady Ashwick has been confused. Thomas has said so." Edmund said, The documented record predates and contradicts that account, Lady Dorothea. She turned to look at him, and something shifted in her face. He was the Earl of Greyvale. He was a senior peer whose standing exceeded Thomas's by 3 degrees of rank. He was not a man whose word, Lady Dorothea's word, could overbalance in a room that also contained a magistrate and a written record. "Eliza," Edmund said then, "not Lady Ashwick, not my lady, but her name, plain and clean, without the apparatus of rank around it." And the room heard it. And what the room heard was not a man addressing his social inferior, but a man calling someone home. Lady Dorothea closed her fan slowly and did not speak again. Mr. Pelham completed his work with the efficiency of a man who has done this before and would prefer to do it as quickly as possible. The warrant he carried was served. Thomas was removed from the room to his study under the magistrate's observation, and the legal proceedings that would follow were set in motion by signatures and a sealed document that Pelham tucked into his case with the unhurried manner of a man confirming what he had already known from the first page. The household stood in a great quiet that was not the usual quiet of Ashwick Park. This quiet had air in it. Cecily had not been present that morning, but word reached her cousin's house in town before noon, and the way the county received the news left no version of the future in which she would recover what she had once expected. She had placed all her certainty in the wrong register. Nance set the morning's tea tray on the sideboard and brought Eliza a cup she had poured herself. Eliza took it and drank it standing at the window where the summer garden lay flat and bright in the late morning sun, and she tasted nothing unusual at all. Only tea. Only the clean, sharp warmth of it, and she thought of everything she had written in the notebook and what all those pages had cost her in patience and stillness and the sustained performance of not yet knowing what she would eventually need to prove. Edmund stayed until Mr. Pelham departed. He came to stand near her at the window, while Nance withdrew to the far end of the room on a quiet errand, and he said, "You will not be required to remain here." "No," she said. "Greyvale Hall has a suite of rooms that have stood empty since my mother moved to the Dower House. They are decent rooms. You would have the run of the library." She looked at him. He was looking out the window at the garden, which meant she had a moment to see his face when he was not preparing it for her to see. "That is a very practical offer," she said. "I am a practical man." He paused. "It is also not entirely practical." He turned then and looked at her directly, the way he had looked at her in Mrs. Prescott's cottage with the rain on his coat, and she felt the old response in her chest that she had been carefully not naming since May. "I am aware that you have spent the last year having choices made for you against your interest. I have no desire to add to that count." "Then ask," she said. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to last. "Will you come to Greyvale?" he said. "Will you consider, when you are ready, whether you might stay?" "I will come," she said. "I am already considering." Nance, at the far end of the room, set down whatever she had been pretending to arrange and allowed herself a small, contained expression of satisfaction. There are moments in a woman's life when the machinery that has been running against her simply stops, and the silence that follows is not emptiness, but space. Eliza stood in that space and let it be what it was. By late summer, the legal matters had advanced with the deliberate momentum of their kind. Thomas's situation was in the hands of the county court and would remain so for longer than Eliza was required to care about it. The £4,000 of her father's debt had been addressed through a settlement that Mr. Pelham's office confirmed in writing, the obligation dissolved by the dissolution of the arrangement that had created it, and Eliza's circumstances were her own for the first time since October of 1811. She moved to Greyvale Hall on a Tuesday in August, with Nance and 2 trunks and the dressing case with the locked compartment, and Edmund met her at the door in his shirt sleeves because he had been working in the stables that morning and had not quite finished when the carriage came up the drive. And she thought, standing in the entrance hall with the late summer light coming through the high windows, that she had never been received anywhere quite like this, in a place that appeared to be simply continuing its life, and was willing to include her in it. The library was as he had promised. She spent 3 mornings in it before she acknowledged to herself what had happened. She had been reading a volume of natural philosophy on the second morning when he had come to find her, not expecting to need to explain his presence, simply coming in and sitting down in the chair across the reading table and opening the estate ledgers he carried with him. They had worked in the same room in silence for 2 hours without difficulty, the way people who have already reached an agreement work, except that the agreement had not yet been named. Nance, carrying a tea tray through the library door on the second afternoon, had looked at the two of them across the table and down at the tray and back at them, and said in her most transparent manner, "I shall leave this on the sideboard." "Thank you, Nance," Eliza said. "My lady," Nance said with a small, deliberate emphasis on the title, and set the tray down and withdrew. Edmund had looked up from the ledgers with something that was as close to amusement as she had yet seen from him, and Eliza had looked at the tray and at the tea and at the 2 cups set in their saucers with perfect neutral innocence, and she had laughed, quietly, for the first time in a long time, and the sound of it in the library was unexpected and real. It was autumn before he asked her formally. The leaves on the beeches at the edge of the park had turned the deep amber they turn in late October, and there was a fire in the library grate, and she had come to think of the library as her room as much as his, which was perhaps the point, the thing he had been tending since August by simply being present in it, without requiring anything of her. He said, "I want to be clear about what I am asking. And why?" She set down her book. "I am asking because I have not wanted anything for myself in 6 years," he said. "And I find that I want this." He paused, and in the pause she could hear the old wound and the old discipline that guarded it. "I want you to have chosen it freely. I need that to be the case." She thought of the gray dress at the altar, and the solicitor's kind summary, and the £4,000 that had closed around her like a room with one door. She thought of Nance's quick hands, and the taste of wrong tea, and 9 pages of careful dates. She thought of Mrs. Prescott's cottage, and the rain, and the way Edmund had looked at her across a sick woman's bed, as though she were something he recognized. "I have been choosing," she said, "since February." He looked at her. "The cups," she said. "Every cup I lifted was a choice. I was deciding what I wanted to survive for." He took her hand. He did it slowly, as he did everything, with full attention, as though the action deserved the same care he gave to estate ledgers and boundary surveys. His hand was warm and steady, and she did not pull away. Outside the library windows, the first snow of the season had begun, early for October, fine and light, coming sideways through the last amber leaves. Eliza watched it through the glass and felt the fire at her back and Edmund's hand around hers, and the library all around them, full of books she had already half read and would read the rest of in the years ahead. On the mantelpiece, where she had placed it the first morning, sat the small journal from Ashwick, its cover dark with handling. She had not opened it since the day she handed the pages to Edmund in the corridor at Shrewsbury. She did not need to. It had served its purpose. What it recorded had already been placed before a magistrate and a physician, and a room full of people who now knew the shape of what Thomas had done, and the record had held. But the journal itself, the object, the thing she had kept and locked and carried in her dressing case through the worst months of her life, was not a document. It was the evidence of what she had been during those months. Exact, patient, refusing to disappear. She looked at it once from across the room in the firelight, and then she looked away, at the snow and at Edmund's profile, which had lost, in the month since June, some fundamental portion of its careful distance. He turned from the window and found her watching him, and he did not pretend not to know what she was thinking. "You are home," he said. "Not a question." She said, "Yes." The fire shifted in the grate. The snow continued outside. The library held them in its particular warmth, and the journal sat on the mantelpiece with all its pages closed, and needed no one to read from it again. If Eliza's story moved you, leave a word in the comments. These are the histories worth keeping. They belong to everyone who has ever stayed patient and chosen, very quietly, to endure.